My name is Charlene Hanlon, and today I'm going to be giving a brief summary of the work conducted during my PhD thesis, titled The Impact of Genetic Selection of Commercial Layers on the Control of the Hypothalamic-Pituitary Gonadal Axis. Traditional models of sexual maturation in the laying hen have relied on long-day photostimulatory periods in order to activate the HPG-axis. This includes the stimulation of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, from the hypothalamus, ultimately leading to the production of follicle-stimulating hormone, as well as luteinizing hormone from the pituitary gland, and estradiol and progesterone from the mature ovary. However, the critical weight hypothesis, which has typically been attributed to mammals, suggests that puberty may be predicted by the accumulation of body fat rather than by age. This held true in Berlebuter studies, as hens with a 1.5% fat pad by 55 weeks of age had never entered lay, while those that reached a 2.5% fat pad had, suggesting that there might be some minimum threshold that has not been investigated in layers. Currently, as these layers have been found to lay prior to a photostimulatory period, we formulated the following hypothesis. For my study, we hypothesized that modern commercial strains of laying hens will display alterations of this HPG axis compared to the currently accepted models. And these will be the changes that are driving the associated changes in production rate that we've seen in these successful laying hens. So for this study, we chose 3 strains of laying hens. We had a Lohmann LSL Light, which is our modern commercial strain, peaking at 95 to 97% production. Then we had a Heritage Shaver White Leghorn, which was donated to the University of Guelph in 2003 by Dr. Don Shaver, and has been maintained in about a mid-2000s commercial equivalency, peaking at 85 to 90%. Then we had our Smoky Joe White Leghorn derivative, and they're the commercial equivalency of the 1960s, so they're only going to peak at about 60 to 70% and drop out pretty rapidly thereafter. And we followed these birds through their entire life cycle of 100 weeks, and we recorded body weights as well as production weekly, and we looked at biweekly blood samples. But in addition to that, we did some tissue sampling time points. And at that, we looked at 12 weeks of age for an immature time point, 17 weeks of age for pre-lay, 20 weeks of age for the initiation of lay, 25 weeks of age for peak of lay, and then 45, 60, and 75 weeks of age during the laying cycle, and 100 weeks of age as the end of the study. And at this time, we were collecting hypothalamus, pituitary gland, ovary, blood, as well as tibia and femur. So I want to look at this in the phases of the hen's life. So first, we're going to look at maturation. So the first thing that we saw was that the age of first egg for the Lohmann and Shaver were significantly earlier than in the Smoky Joe. Now, this was to be expected, as the 1960s, they hadn't quite optimized that entry into lay, but by the early 2000s, we had pretty much optimized that. We don't want to push that any further because we want the hen to have the body that's able to sustain lay for the rest of the cycle. But one of the interesting points here is that regardless of the age, strain, or the photostimulatory period, the body weight at the age of first egg all fell within a 64-gram window. So while there were no apparent differences in body weight despite the differences in age, the absence of changes in VA-opsin and OPN5 between the strains demonstrated that photoperiodic mechanisms are not likely responsible for triggering the changes in the timing of maturation. However, there might be some role there for either a body weight or a metabolic response. Now, looking at that egg production, what we saw was that the Lohmann hens were able to peak at 99.8%, while the Shavers peaked at 91.4%, and the Smoky Joes peaked at 68.4%. Now, one of the interesting things I want to point out here is that we did photostimulate these hens at 18 weeks of age. And you can see that there's actually production beginning at 18 weeks of age for the Lohmann and Shaver hens. And then they rapidly come into production thereafter, whereas you see that more delayed response in the Smoky Joe, which is what we would expect from a photostimulation at 18 weeks of age. This was in line with the estradiol that we analyzed, as we saw that, again, at 18 weeks of age, we had pretty much a plateaued flat line for the Smoky Joe, but after that photostimulatory period, there was a rapid increase in estradiol. But in the case of the Lohmann and Shaver, we saw that increase at 18 weeks of age occurring already. So it didn't seem that photostimulation was required to initiate this process. In fact, the functional peaks in estradiol were found to be significantly earliest in the Lohmann at 19.2 weeks of age, compared to the Shaver at 19.65 and the Smoky Joe at 20.67. Now, when we looked at the HPG-axis itself, we didn't see any differences in GnRH or GnIH levels, but we did see differences in the receptors. For GnIH receptor mRNA, we found that there was a significant decline between 17 and 20 weeks of age only in the lumen. It's a very coordinated decline and synchronized within the strain. And while we did see a decline in the shaver and a little bit more in a little bit less in the Smoky Joe, what we did find was that there was a significant increase in GnRH receptor 3 from between 17 and 20 weeks of age in only the lumen hens. So it showed that the switch in pituitary sensitivity to these reproductive neuropeptides was evident only in the lumen strain during this maturation process. Now, when we looked at FSH, we did see a synchronized initial peak in at 20 weeks of age, and that's to be expected as our sampling paradigm really only led to 17, 20, and 25 weeks of age, which is a pretty big gap. But one of the interesting things that came out of this was that there was recurrent elevations at 60 and 100 weeks of age in the lumen hens. So we wanted to look more at that persistency side now. So while we looked at the egg production, we found that the lumen hens never dropped below 80% production, while these shavers did have a decline around 80 weeks of age, but there was a spontaneous molt in about 50% of these hens, so we did see a return in production. In the Smoky Joes, there was actually spontaneous molts happening in about 80 to 90% of these hens, so we see that they're constantly coming in and out of lay, giving us that more up and down pattern in their production. But that resulted ultimately in 515 eggs for lumens, 417 eggs for the shavers, and 257 for the Smoky Joe. Now, when we looked at the entire estradiol profiles of these hens, we were able to see recurrent elevations early on in lumen and shaver hens with an elevated plateau around 50 to 80 weeks of age. But looking at the individual profiles, this was a result of unsynchronized recurrent elevations within these strains. Thus, when we smoothed the curves, we found 5 peaks in the lumen, 3 peaks in the shaver, and 3 peaks in the Smoky Joe. Now, in the case of the Smoky Joe, these additional peaks were the result of spontaneous molts in the strain, and we would expect to see an increase in estradiol with a return to lay. But in the shaver, as I said, 50% of these hens had undergone the spontaneous molt, indicating that these elevations were also present in those hens, but there were persistent layers that were displaying these peaks as well. And the ability of these persistent layers to elevate an estradiol was confirmed in lumen hens, as these displayed the most peaks despite no molt in any of these birds. Now, when we looked at the ovary weight, we found that the lumen ovary was consistently heavier than both the shaver and the Smoky Joe, particularly at 100 weeks of age by the end of that study. And when we looked at the less than 1 millimeter follicles, which are responsible for estradiol production, we found a similar trend. So this started to suggest that these recurrent elevations in estradiol are linked to the continuous recruitment of the follicular pool, and that allows for the sustained production above 80% for the remainder of that laying cycle. Now, we did want to look at bone and eggshell quality to make sure that none of this was detrimental to the hen. And what we found was that cortical bone was not different between the strains, and it did not decline throughout the course of the study. In the case of medullary bone, again, there was no differences really between the strains, but there was a similar pattern of elevation during that laying cycle. So while we did find that estradiol was negatively correlated with cortical bone mineral density and positively correlated with medullary bone mineral density in only the lumen and shaver lines, it didn't seem like these extra elevations in estradiol had any detrimental effects on the bones, and it rather seems that there's some sort of mechanism that's allowing for a sustained bone growth while also sustaining both the laying cycle and, in fact, the shell quality. So while there was a decline in shell quality, which is to be expected over the course of a laying cycle, it never declined past the point of any other strain. And that's particularly important because, as you can see, the Smoky Joe had the lowest breaking strength at 90 weeks of age, and the shaver had the lowest strength at 100. And those birds both produced 100 and 250 eggs less than the lumens, respectively. So we can really see that these hens are able to sustain their laying production with no detriment to the product or the hen herself. Now, more of the future studies outlook is the orexogenic mRNA levels. So again, like I said, the body weight seems to be playing a key role. So we wanted to look at the appetite control a little bit. And what we did find was that HERP and MPY mRNA levels were correlated highest during the maturation of the lumen. But due to the fact that HERP was highest in the Smoky Joe at 25 weeks of age, while MPY was highest at 12, there was no correlation between these erexogenic peptides in the Smoky Joe. So it's interesting that this coordination seems to have evolved over time. And further investigations are going to be required with more frequent time samples, and that's being conducted now in our lab. So overall, sexual maturation showed us that body weight and or metabolic triggers can override photostimulatory cues in modern commercial layers. And an earlier rise in estradiol has resulted in advancing the cascade of the HPG-axis. On the side of the persistency of lay, recurrent elevations in estradiol have been associated with a greater number of less than 1 millimeter follicles. And we have a maintained egg and bone quality up to 100 weeks of age, with these modern commercial hens reaching well over 500 eggs in 100 weeks of life. I want to thank my advisor, Dr. Gregor Videgratz, one of the master students in our lab, Kaio Takashima, and the Arkel Poultry Research Station staff, as well as all the undergraduate research assistants and volunteers on this project, and last but not least, all of our funding agencies. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Charlene, for that overall summary of a long-haul project. And as I'm waiting for a couple of questions from the audience, based on your data, do you think there is any rationale to terminate layer flux at 72 weeks?
Based on the data that we collected, it doesn't seem like there's any rationale behind it other than the issues with the pullet raisers. I would say that it looks like the hen can sustain lay throughout the 100 weeks, maintain her bone quality, maintain the egg quality, which is important for the health and the consumer product. And it seems like these boosts in estradiol may actually be overall a benefit to the health so far, but further investigation will be required on that side.
Okay, yeah, and I think that's an important, because one of the rationale always was the issue of osteoporosis and decrease in shell quality. That was kind of the rationale for terminating layer flux early. So based on your data, you don't think that's an issue anymore?
Yeah,